Imagine waking up tomorrow and the American economy has suddenly ground to a halt. Stock markets are crashing, unemployment is skyrocketing, and across the ocean, entire nations are starting to crumble like dominoes. Sounds dramatic? Maybe. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Over $25 trillion worth of global trade depends directly on American consumers opening their wallets. When the U.S. economy catches a cold, some countries don't just sneeze, they collapse. But who's really dancing on the edge of the cliff? Which nations have tied their entire economic fate to Uncle Sam's credit card? Today, we're exposing the 10 countries that could face absolute economic devastation if the United States slides into recession in 2025. We're talking currency meltdowns, mass unemployment, food shortages, and political chaos. And trust me, some of these might shock you. Let's dive in. Number 10. Bangladesh. Picture this. You're working 12-hour shifts in a cramped factory in Dhaka, stitching together clothes that'll be sold at Target and Walmart across America. Your weekly paycheck? Maybe $60 if you're lucky. Now imagine that factory shutting down because American consumers suddenly stopped buying. That's the nightmare Bangladesh could face if the U.S. economy tanks. Bangladesh is the second largest garment exporter in the world. And guess who's buying? That's right, American shoppers account for nearly 17% of Bangladesh's total exports, worth over $8 billion annually. But here's where it gets scary. The garment industry alone employs over 4 million people in Bangladesh, most of them women. If U.S. demand drops by just 30%, we're looking at potentially 1.2 million job losses almost overnight. And those workers? They're supporting families, sometimes 6 or 7 people on a single income. When those paychecks vanish, you're not just talking unemployment, you're talking hunger. Then there's the currency problem. The Bangladeshi taka has been under pressure for years, and Bangladesh's foreign reserves stood at just $20 billion in late 2024. That's barely enough to cover 3 months of imports. If export revenues collapse and capital starts fleeing, the taka could plunge by 40% or more against the dollar. Suddenly, importing food, fuel, and medicine becomes impossibly expensive. Inflation, which already hit 9.5% in 2024, could easily spike past 15%. And let's not forget the social consequences. Bangladesh already struggles with overcrowding, poverty, and political instability. In 2024, violent protests over wages left dozens dead. Now add mass unemployment, soaring food prices, and a worthless currency into that powder keg. Bangladesh isn't just at risk of economic collapse, it's at risk of social explosion. So while Bangladesh might be thousands of miles from Wall Street, its fate is chained directly to America's economic health. Number 9. Ethiopia. Now let's talk about Ethiopia, a country that doesn't export much to the U.S. directly, but is so economically fragile that even a ripple from an American recession could shatter it completely. Ethiopia's economy runs on 3 things: coffee exports, foreign aid, and remittances from Ethiopians working abroad, many of them in the United States. Here's the problem. Ethiopia sends home over $1.5 billion in remittances every year, and a huge chunk comes from the Ethiopian diaspora in America. If the U.S. enters recession, jobs disappear. Construction workers, taxi drivers, healthcare aides, these are the people sending money back home. And when those dollars dry up, millions of Ethiopian families lose their lifeline. We're talking about kids being pulled out of school, families skipping meals, medical care becoming unaffordable. But it gets worse. Ethiopia is already drowning in debt. The country owes over $28 billion to foreign creditors, and its debt-to-GDP ratio is approaching 60%. If foreign currency inflows drop, Ethiopia won't be able to service that debt. Default becomes a real possibility. And when a country defaults, the consequences are catastrophic. Credit freezes, import shortages, hyperinflation. Ethiopia's birr has already lost over 30% of its value in the past 2 years. Another major shock could send it into freefall. Then there's the humanitarian angle. Ethiopia is dealing with ongoing conflict, drought, and food insecurity. Over 20 million people are already in need of humanitarian assistance. If the economy collapses, aid agencies will be overwhelmed. Famine becomes a genuine risk. And don't forget about coffee, Ethiopia's biggest export. If the global economy slows and demand for premium coffee drops, Ethiopian coffee farmers, who are already struggling, could see their incomes collapse. Ethiopia might not be on the radar for most Americans, but it's sitting on a knife's edge. One economic shock could push it over. Number 8. Philippines. Let's head to Southeast Asia. The Philippines, known for beautiful beaches, friendly people, and a massive workforce spread across the globe. But here's the thing. The Filipino economy is built on remittances. Over 10 million Filipinos work abroad, and they send home a staggering $36 billion every year. That's about 9% of the country's entire GDP. And guess where a lot of those workers are? You got it, the United States. Filipinos make up one of the largest immigrant groups in America, working as nurses, caregivers, engineers, and service workers. If a U.S. recession hits, these jobs are vulnerable. Healthcare cuts, corporate layoffs, reduced consumer spending, all of this directly impacts Filipino workers abroad. And when their paychecks shrink or disappear, the ripple effect back home is devastating. Think about it. Filipino families rely on those remittances for everything: education, housing, medical care, even daily food. If remittances drop by 20%, that's over $7 billion gone from the economy. Small businesses that depend on consumer spending collapse. Construction projects stall. Banks face higher default rates on loans. Poverty, which already affects nearly 18% of the population, could spike dramatically. Then there's the peso. The Philippine peso is highly sensitive to dollar inflows. During economic downturns, the peso weakens, making imports more expensive. The Philippines imports huge amounts of oil, rice, and machinery. If the peso drops 15 to 20%, inflation skyrockets. Fuel prices go up, food prices soar, and ordinary Filipinos get crushed. And let's not ignore the political instability this could trigger. The Philippines has a history of mass protests and political upheaval when economic conditions deteriorate. If millions of families suddenly lose their main income source, social unrest becomes almost inevitable. President Marcos's government could face massive pressure, potentially destabilizing the entire region. So while the Philippines might seem resilient, it's actually incredibly vulnerable to an American economic sneeze. Number 7. Turkey. Now let's talk about Turkey, a country that's already walking a tightrope economically, and an American recession could be the gust of wind that sends it tumbling. Turkey's economy is complicated. It's not heavily dependent on direct exports to the U.S., but it's deeply entangled in global financial markets. And when the U.S. economy stumbles, global markets panic. Capital flees emerging markets. And Turkey? It's one of the first countries investors abandon. Here's the nightmare scenario. Turkey's external debt is over $450 billion. Much of that debt is denominated in U.S. dollars and euros. If a U.S. recession triggers a stronger dollar, which often happens as investors flee to safety, servicing that debt becomes exponentially more expensive for Turkey. We're talking about billions of additional dollars needed just to make interest payments. And Turkey's currency, the lira, has already been a disaster. It lost over 80% of its value between 2018 and 2024. Another major shock could send it spiraling even further. Why does this matter? Because Turkey imports almost everything: energy, food, machinery. When the lira collapses, import costs explode. Inflation, which hit 64% in 2024, could easily surge past 100%. Ordinary Turks would see their savings wiped out, their purchasing power evaporate, and basic necessities become unaffordable. But wait, there's more. Turkey's banking sector is fragile. Turkish banks hold massive amounts of lira-denominated assets, but have dollar-denominated liabilities. If the lira crashes, banks face a currency mismatch crisis. Bank runs become a real possibility. And if the banking system freezes, the entire economy grinds to a halt. Companies can't get credit, paychecks stop, chaos ensues. Politically, this could be explosive. President Erdogan has maintained power partly through economic growth and populist spending. If the economy collapses, his grip weakens. Protests, political instability, even the risk of a coup, all of this becomes more likely. Turkey is a NATO member and a key geopolitical player. Its collapse would send shockwaves far beyond its borders. Number 6. Nigeria. Let's head to Africa's most populous nation, Nigeria. With over 220 million people, Nigeria is an economic giant on the continent. But here's the catch. It's a giant with feet of clay. Nigeria's economy is overwhelmingly dependent on oil exports, and guess what happens to oil prices when the U.S. economy tanks? They collapse. Nigeria exports about 2 million barrels of oil per day, and oil revenues account for over 90% of the country's export earnings and about 50% of government revenue. When the U.S. goes into recession, global demand for oil plummets. Prices crash. During the 2020 pandemic downturn, oil prices briefly went negative. If that happens again, Nigeria's economy is toast. Here's what an oil price collapse means for Nigeria. Government revenues evaporate. Infrastructure projects halt. Public sector salaries get delayed or cut. And because Nigeria imports almost everything food, fuel, machinery, the naira collapses. Inflation, which was already at 28% in 2024, could spike to 50% or higher. Ordinary Nigerians, who already struggle with poverty, unemployment, and insecurity, would face even worse conditions. Food insecurity would skyrocket. Medical care becomes unaffordable. Schools close, and the social fabric starts to tear. But the most terrifying aspect is the security situation. Nigeria is already battling Boko Haram in the northeast, banditry in the northwest, and separatist movements in the southeast. Economic collapse provides fuel for these conflicts. When young men can't find jobs, when families can't afford food, when governments can't provide services, violence escalates. Nigeria could face a full-blown humanitarian crisis, potentially displacing millions and destabilizing the entire West African region. And here's the kicker. Nigeria is Africa's largest economy. If Nigeria collapses, it doesn't just affect 220 million Nigerians, it sends shockwaves across the entire continent. Neighboring countries that depend on trade with Nigeria suffer. Refugees flood across borders. Regional instability spirals. An American recession doesn't just hurt Nigeria, it could trigger a continental crisis. Number 5. Egypt, the land of the pyramids, is facing a modern-day curse, economic fragility. Egypt's economy is a house of cards built on tourism, Suez Canal revenues, remittances, and massive external borrowing. And here's the problem, an American recession threatens almost all of these at once. Let's start with tourism. Egypt welcomes over 13 million tourists annually, generating about $13 billion in revenue. Americans make up a significant portion of these visitors. If the U.S. enters recession, discretionary spending on international vacations is one of the first things to go. Tourism revenues could drop by 30 to 40%. That means thousands of hotels, restaurants, tour operators, and souvenir shops suddenly lose business. Hundreds of thousands of Egyptians employed in tourism face unemployment. Then there's the Suez Canal, one of Egypt's prized assets. The canal generates over $8 billion annually in revenues. But here's the thing. Canal traffic is directly tied to global trade. If the U.S. economy contracts, global trade volumes shrink. Fewer ships pass through the canal. Revenues drop. Add in remittances. Over 10 million Egyptians work abroad, many in the U.S. and Gulf countries. If the U.S. and global economies slow, remittances dry up. That's another critical revenue stream gone. Now here's where it gets really scary. Egypt's external debt exceeds $160 billion. The country is paying billions annually just in debt service. If revenues collapse and the Egyptian pound weakens, it already lost over 50% of its value in 2022 to 2023. Servicing that debt becomes impossible. Default looms. And if Egypt defaults, the consequences are catastrophic. IMF bailouts come with painful austerity measures, subsidy cuts, tax hikes, public sector layoffs. This triggers massive social unrest. Remember the Arab Spring? Egypt was ground zero. Economic desperation can reignite that kind of upheaval. Egypt also faces a ticking demographic time bomb. With a population of over 105 million and limited arable land, The country imports over 60% of its food, especially wheat. If the currency collapses and import costs soar, bread prices spike. And in Egypt, bread is heavily subsidized and deeply symbolic. Bread riots have toppled governments before. An American recession could be the spark that ignites another Egyptian crisis, with consequences that ripple across the Middle East and North Africa. Number 4. Argentina. Argentina, a country that seems perpetually on the brink of economic disaster. And an American recession? That could be the final push over the edge. Argentina's economy is a mess. Inflation hit over 140% in 2024. The peso is in freefall. Debt default is a recurring theme, and the country is already in a fragile state. Now throw in an American recession. Here's how it plays out. Argentina's biggest export? Agricultural products, soybeans, corn, beef, wine. The US and China are major buyers. If the US economy tanks, demand for these goods drops, prices fall. Argentine farmers and exporters lose income. Export revenues collapse. But the real killer is the currency. Argentina has a long history of currency crises, hyperinflation, and capital flight. If a U.S. recession triggers global market panic, investors pull money out of Argentina faster than you can say _0_. The peso, which has already lost nearly all its value, could enter hyperinflation territory. We're talking 500%, 1,000%, even higher. What does hyperinflation look like? Savings evaporate. Prices double every few weeks. People spend money as fast as they get it because tomorrow it'll be worthless. Businesses can't plan. Contracts become meaningless. The economy grinds to a halt. And Argentina's debt? The country already defaulted in 2020. It owes over $45 billion to the IMF alone. If export revenues crash and the peso collapses, there's no way Argentina can pay. Another default becomes inevitable, and each default makes recovery harder. Politically, Argentina is a powder keg. President Javier Milei has implemented radical economic reforms, slashing subsidies, cutting government spending, devaluing the currency. These measures are painful, and public patience is thin. If the economy collapses further, mass protests erupt. Political instability follows. Argentina could descend into chaos, with ripple effects across South America. An American recession doesn't just hurt Argentina, it could push it into full economic and political meltdown. Number 3. Pakistan. We touched on Pakistan earlier, but let's dig deeper because the situation is truly dire. Pakistan is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to an American recession. Here's why. First, remittances. Over 9 million Pakistanis work abroad, and they send home over $30 billion annually, about 8% of GDP. A huge chunk of those workers are in the United States. If the U.S. economy tanks, those remittances dry up. Families back home lose their primary income. Poverty spikes. Second, exports. Pakistan's garment and textile industries depend heavily on American buyers. If U.S. demand collapses, factories close, and millions of workers lose their jobs. Third, and this is the killer, foreign exchange reserves. Pakistan's reserves are dangerously low, under $8 billion in 2024. That's barely enough to cover 2 months of imports. If remittances fall and export revenues drop, Pakistan can't afford to import essentials like oil, food, and medicine. Shortages become widespread. Inflation, already at 29%, explodes. Then there's the currency. The Pakistani rupee has lost over 28% of its value recently. Another shock could send it into freefall. Suddenly, importing anything becomes impossibly expensive. Fuel prices soar. Food prices double. Ordinary Pakistanis, who are already struggling, face absolute desperation. And Pakistan's political situation is a tinderbox. The country faces terrorism, ethnic tensions, and political instability. Economic collapse would be gasoline on that fire. Mass protests, violence, even the risk of state failure, all of this becomes more likely. Pakistan is also a nuclear-armed state. Its collapse would have catastrophic regional and global implications. India, Afghanistan, China, all would be affected. An American recession doesn't just threaten Pakistan, it threatens the stability of South Asia. Pakistan is standing on the thinnest ice and the cracks are already showing. Number 2. Greece. Remember the Greek debt crisis of 2010 to 2015? Unemployment over 25%? Pensions slashed? Austerity riots? Greece nearly left the Eurozone. Well, guess what? Greece is still fragile, and an American recession could trigger Greek crisis 2.0. Here's the situation. Greece's economy is heavily dependent on tourism and shipping. Over 30 million tourists visit Greece annually, generating about 20% of GDP. Americans are some of the biggest spenders among tourists. If the U.S. enters recession, tourism revenue collapses. Hotels close. Restaurants shut down. Thousands of tourism workers lose their jobs. Unemployment, which finally dropped below 11% in 2024, shoots back up. Then there's shipping. Greece has one of the largest merchant fleets in the world. Greek ship owners control about 20% of the global fleet. But shipping is directly tied to global trade. If the U.S. economy contracts, global trade volumes shrink. Shipping demand drops. Revenues fall. Greek shipping companies and the thousands of sailors they employ suffer. And Greece's debt? Still over 160% of GDP, one of the highest in the world. Greece is making payments, but barely. If revenues collapse, Greece can't service that debt. Another default looms, and this time, the Eurozone might not bail them out. The social consequences would be severe. Greeks already endured a decade of painful austerity. Another crisis would reignite protests, strikes, and political extremism. The rise of far-right and far-left parties becomes more likely. Greece could become ungovernable. And there's a geopolitical angle. Greece is a NATO member and sits at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Its instability affects migration routes, energy pipelines, and regional security. An American recession doesn't just hurt Greece, it destabilizes the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Number 1. Mexico. And finally, the country most at risk, Mexico. Mexico and the United States share more than a border, they share an economy. Over 80% of Mexico's exports go to the United States. That's over $450 billion annually. Cars, electronics, machinery, food, you name it, it's heading north. If the U.S. economy crashes, Mexico's economy doesn't just slow, it collapses. Let's start with manufacturing. Mexico is a manufacturing powerhouse thanks to NAFTA, now USMCA. American companies have built massive supply chains in Mexico. Auto plants, electronics factories, aerospace facilities. But these industries exist to serve American consumers. If Americans stop buying, these factories shut down. Millions of Mexican workers lose their jobs overnight. The auto industry alone is massive. Mexico exports nearly 3 million vehicles annually to the U.S. During the 2008 recession, Mexican auto production dropped by 30%. That kind of collapse devastated entire communities. Then there's remittances. Mexicans working in the U.S. send home over $60 billion annually, about 4% of Mexico's GDP. An American recession means job losses for those workers. Remittances plummet. Millions of Mexican families lose their financial lifeline. And the peso? Oh, the peso is going to tank. During economic crises, the peso loses value fast. In 2020, it dropped by over 20% in a matter of weeks. If it crashes again, inflation explodes. Imported goods, fuel, food, medicine become unaffordable. Mexican consumers get crushed. But here's the real nightmare: violence. Mexico already struggles with cartel violence, corruption, and weak institutions. Economic collapse makes all of this worse. When people lose jobs and hope, crime spikes. Cartel recruitment becomes easier. Violence escalates, and desperate Mexicans start migrating north, creating a humanitarian and political crisis at the U.S. border. Mexico is America's second-largest trading partner and its neighbor. If Mexico collapses, it doesn't just affect 130 million Mexicans, it affects the United States directly. Border security, Migration, trade, drug trafficking, all of this gets exponentially worse. An American recession and a Mexican collapse would be a nightmare scenario for both countries. Mexico isn't just number one on this list, it's in a category of its own. So there you have it, 10 countries standing on the edge of economic disaster, all waiting to see if the United States stumbles. From Bangladesh to Mexico, these nations have tied their fates to the American economy. And if that economy crashes, the dominoes start falling. We're talking about millions of jobs lost, currencies collapsing, political chaos, and humanitarian crises. The world is more interconnected than ever, and that means when America catches a cold, entire nations face collapse. So, what do you think? Did any of these countries surprise you? Let me know in the comments. And if you found this video eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because the global economy is a wild ride, and we're all strapped in together.